In an era marked by rapid social upheaval, political polarization, and what many describe as fundamental vibe shifts in society, millions of people across the globe feel as though the political ground beneath their feet is constantly shifting. Some yearn nostalgically for a return to what they perceive as simpler times, when social roles seemed clearer, political discourse felt more civil, and perhaps most importantly, when there existed a stronger sense of common national purpose that transcended individual differences. Others, meanwhile, find themselves grappling with more troubling questions that seem to have no easy answers. How did our societies begin traveling down these increasingly divisive and polarized paths? What hidden agendas and systematic forces are actually driving these dramatic social and political changes that we witness daily in our communities, workplaces, and political institutions? And perhaps most urgently of all, if we can identify these destructive patterns early enough, is it still possible to reverse course before irreparable damage is done to the fabric of democratic society? Jason Stanley's How Fascism Works provides a rigorous analytical framework for understanding these contemporary challenges through the lens of historical precedent and political theory.
While fascism remains a term with complex and often hotly debated definitions among scholars and political observers, Stanley's analysis seeks to demonstrate that the intentional deepening of social divisions along ethnic, racial, religious, and cultural lines can only lead societies down an increasingly dark and dangerous path, one that ultimately culminates in the complete breakdown of social solidarity and democratic governance. The book examines the sophisticated mechanisms through which truth and objective reality itself can be systematically undermined by authoritarian political movements, resulting in disoriented and confused populations that become increasingly susceptible to manipulation by demagogic leaders who promise simple solutions to complex problems. Perhaps most crucially, Stanley's work revisits historical episodes where the lights of human dignity and democratic governance seem to dim significantly or even go out entirely. Those dark periods when fascist movements successfully captured state power and implemented their vision of society. These historical episodes serve as more than mere cautionary tales. They provide essential insights into understanding our current political moment and the warning signs that democratic societies must learn to recognize before it becomes too late to respond effectively. After all, it is only through developing a sophisticated understanding of how authoritarian movements have succeeded in the past that we can hope to learn from history's most painful lessons and prevent their repetition in our own time. Chapter 1: The Foundational Building Blocks of Fascist Ideology. To truly comprehend how an ideology as destructive and dehumanizing as fascism can take root within seemingly civilized societies and flourish even among educated populations, our investigation must begin by examining its foundational building blocks and core philosophical components. These elements don't emerge spontaneously from nowhere. Rather, they develop systematically by drawing upon existing philosophical traditions, political precedents, and cultural narratives from various nationalist, authoritarian, and revolutionary movements throughout history. While different fascist movements across time and geography have emphasized certain aspects more heavily than others, reflecting local conditions, cultural contexts, and specific historical grievances, nearly all fascist tendencies draw from a remarkably consistent set of principles and rhetorical strategies that fuel their distinctive worldview and political approach. The power of mythologized storytelling. Perhaps the most fundamental and psychologically powerful component of fascist ideology is its masterful use of storytelling, particularly the construction of romantic, idealized narratives about a glorious national past. This mythologized golden age is presented as a time when the nation was demonstrably stronger, more unified, and more ethical than it is today. Citizens lived according to traditional values,
social roles were clearly defined and broadly accepted, and the country commanded respect and fear from its international competitors. This carefully constructed vision of historical greatness stands in deliberate and stark contrast to the perceived chaos, confusion, and moral decay of the contemporary moment. The present day is portrayed as an era where the nation has become weak, divided, and morally compromised, where traditional institutions have been corrupted or destroyed, and where foreign influences and internal enemies have gained dangerous amounts of power and influence. The only viable solution to these contemporary problems, according to fascist narratives, is a dramatic return to this mythologized past, a restoration of the golden age when things were unquestionably better for the deserving members of the national community. This return requires strong leadership, decisive action, and the willingness to sweep away the corrupted institutions and compromised leaders who have allowed the nation to fall into its current degraded state. Benito Mussolini, the founder of Italian fascism, understood intuitively the profound psychological power that such narratives possessed to sway hearts and minds, particularly during times of social and economic uncertainty. In the case of Italy during the early 1920s, political and economic conditions were indeed challenging. Despite the country's technical status as a victor in the First World War, Italy continued to struggle with severe economic decay, political violence, social unrest, and a profound sense of national humiliation regarding its limited territorial gains from the conflict. To combat these real problems and widespread feelings of national disappointment, Mussolini proposed a dramatic return to a golden age when the nation could be imagined as a truly unified society based on the supposed virtues and strength of ancient Rome. By invoking the glorious legacy of the Roman Empire and promising to restore Italy's rightful place as a dominant force in European and Mediterranean affairs, he offered his followers a compelling vision of national renewal that would put an end to weakness, division, and international humiliation. The emphasis on masculine strength and patriarchal authority. One aspect that appears consistently across different fascist movements is their heavy emphasis on promoting and celebrating virility, masculine strength, and traditional gender roles as essential components of national renewal. This involves placing the patriarchal family structure firmly at the center of social life and political organization, presenting it as both natural and morally superior to alternative family arrangements or gender role configurations. The narrative typically begins at the very top of the political hierarchy, with the leader of the nation or movement positioned as the ultimate father figure for the entire people. His fitness to rule is presented not as the result of democratic selection, policy expertise, or administrative competence, but rather as a natural expression of masculine authority that mirrors the supposed natural authority of fathers within traditional family structures. This deliberate linking of family structure and national leadership serves a specific strategic purpose. It connects citizens' desire for a return to supposedly simpler times with an acceptance of increasingly authoritarian leadership styles and the concentration of power in the hands of a single strong leader who promises to restore order and traditional values. The creation of us versus them dynamics. Once this foundational acceptance of authoritarian leadership begins to take hold among significant portions of the population, fascist narratives typically advance to the next crucial stage, the creation of a clearly defined us versus them dynamic that divides society into those who belong to the true national community and those who do not, to effectively create a unified sense of us, those who are presented as the true successors and inheritors of the idealized past. It becomes necessary to define a contrasting them, consisting of those who are explicitly excluded from the national family,
and portrayed as threats to its continued existence and prosperity. The creation of such an other is typically justified through arguments that portray group differences not as social constructs that have developed through historical processes, but rather as deep-seated, unchangeable, and biologically determined distinctions. These divisions might be based on racial, religious, ethnic, or cultural characteristics, which are promoted as immutable realities that cannot be bridged through education, integration, or social reform. Once these fundamental divisions become entrenched in popular consciousness and accepted as natural facts rather than political choices, any substantive political challenge to the fascist movement can be effectively reframed as a hostile act against the very fabric and essence of the nation itself. This rhetorical strategy paves the way for increasingly aggressive attacks on the democratic institutions, independent media, academic establishments, and civil society organizations that have the potential to launch such challenges to fascist authority. Chapter 2: The Systematic Assault on Truth and Reality. Once fascist movements have successfully established the foundational elements of an us versus them dynamic within society, they typically move on to the far more sophisticated and dangerous task of systematically shifting the way entire populations perceive truth, evidence, and reality itself. This represents one of the most insidious aspects of fascist political strategy, because if people remain too attached to shared standards of evidence, rational debate, and objective truth-seeking, it becomes significantly more difficult to promote and maintain the social divisions that fascist movements require to maintain power. Targeting educational institutions and intellectual authority. A common starting point for these systematic attacks on truth and reality is the targeting of educational institutions, particularly universities and other centers of higher learning. These institutions are targeted precisely because they are designed by their very nature to promote critical thinking, open debate, rational inquiry, and exposure to diverse perspectives and methodologies for understanding complex social and natural phenomena. This is why fascist movements, both historical and contemporary, consistently denounce universities as hotbeds of Marxist indoctrination, cultural Marxism, or other forms of supposed ideological corruption. Such accusations serve the strategic purpose of discrediting educational institutions by painting them as controlled by out-of-touch elites who are fundamentally at odds with the nation's supposedly authentic traditional values and the common sense of ordinary citizens. Simultaneously, experts, academics, scientists, and intellectuals who promote ideas, research findings, or analytical frameworks that contradict fascist narratives are systematically labeled as corrupt, biased, foreign-influenced, or worse still, as active participants in shadowy conspiracies designed to undermine national strength and traditional values. The overarching goal of these attacks is to discredit any alternative sources of authority, expertise, or credibility that might end up challenging fascist narratives or providing citizens with tools for independent critical thinking. The promotion of unreality through misinformation. Once voices of reason, expertise, and independent inquiry have been sufficiently marginalized or silenced, what Stanley terms unreality begins to take hold throughout society. This constitutes a comprehensive worldview that is deliberately fueled by misinformation, conspiracy theories, and emotionally appealing but factually baseless claims about how the world actually works. Importantly, the primary goal of promoting unreality isn't always to convince people to literally believe every detail of the false information being circulated. Instead, the strategic objective is to sow widespread doubt, confusion, and suspicion throughout society, making it increasingly difficult for citizens to distinguish between reliable and unreliable sources of information, or to maintain confidence in their ability to understand complex social and political developments. A historical example that illustrates this dynamic perfectly is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion,
a completely fabricated document from 1903 that falsely claimed to reveal a secret Jewish conspiracy for global domination through control of financial systems, media organizations, and political institutions. While not every person who encountered this document believed its contents literally or in their entirety, it nonetheless succeeded in fueling widespread anti-Semitism throughout the early 20th century across Europe and beyond. Crucially, this fabricated document became a cornerstone of Nazi ideology and propaganda, helping to justify increasingly severe persecution of Jewish communities throughout German-occupied territory. The political power of such fabrications lies not in their factual accuracy or logical coherence, but rather in the doubt, suspicion, and paranoia they generate. Even the mere suggestion of hidden conspiracies and secret agendas can systematically erode public trust in democratic institutions and create a social climate in which it becomes progressively harder for ordinary citizens to know what's real, who to believe, or how to make informed political decisions. The impoverishment of political language. This systematic degradation of public discourse often leads to language itself becoming impoverished and stripped of nuance, complexity, and substantive content. Issues that were once understood to require careful analysis, expert knowledge, and thoughtful debate are increasingly reduced to simple slogans, emotionally charged catchphrases, and tribal loyalty tests that discourage rather than encourage serious thinking about policy alternatives. This phenomenon is not merely an unintended side effect of political polarization. It represents a deliberate strategy that fascist movements have historically used to great effect. Steve Bannon, the right-wing political strategist who served as a key architect of Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign, has been remarkably open about embracing and implementing similar methods in contemporary American politics. Bannon has specifically noted in interviews and public statements that phrases like "lock her up," "build the wall," and "drain the swamp" were carefully crafted and strategically deployed to harness voter anger and fear rather than to promote serious policy discussions about criminal justice, immigration reform, or government accountability. These slogans were designed to circumvent rational deliberation and appeal directly to emotional responses and tribal identification. This approach mirrors strategies outlined in Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, where he explicitly emphasizes the crucial importance of propaganda being both popular in its appeal and reliant on simple, memorable slogans that can be repeated endlessly until they become accepted as common sense. Hitler understood that complex political arguments require sustained attention and critical thinking skills that many citizens either lack or are unwilling to deploy, especially during times of economic hardship or social uncertainty. Once this style of slogan-based political communication becomes dominant within a society's public discourse, it becomes progressively more difficult for citizens to engage in the kind of thoughtful, evidence-based debate that democratic governance requires to function effectively. The stage is then set for channeling popular anger, anxiety, and resentment toward carefully chosen scapegoats who can be blamed for society's problems without requiring voters to grapple with complex policy solutions or trade-offs. Chapter 3: Cultivating Victimhood and Manufacturing. Moral Panics. With a sufficient state of unreality established throughout society, populations become far more vulnerable to political arguments that are based primarily on emotional manipulation rather than factual evidence or logical reasoning. This represents the stage where fascist movements begin cultivating a distinctive and psychologically powerful sense of victimhood among their core supporters, but with a crucial and particularly insidious twist that inverts traditional understanding of social justice and oppression. The inversion of victimhood narratives. Rather than acknowledging the legitimate grievances and historical experiences of actually marginalized communities, racial minorities, religious minorities, immigrants, women, LGBTQ+ individuals, or other groups that have faced systematic discrimination. Fascist narratives instead suggest that it is the dominant group, the traditional majority, that represents the true victims in contemporary society. This dominant group is portrayed as being under siege, facing existential threats to its status, traditions, cultural values, and even its basic survival as a distinct community. The narrative suggests that while minorities and other historically oppressed groups may complain about discrimination or inequality, they are actually the ones who have gained unfair advantages and special privileges at the expense of the supposedly more deserving majority population. Adding insult to injury in this narrative framework is the claim that legitimate calls for equality, civil rights protections, or social justice from minority communities are deliberately reframed as forms of discrimination against the majority population.
This rhetorical strategy has deep historical roots in American politics and provides a clear example of how victimhood narratives are constructed and deployed. President Andrew Johnson, Abraham Lincoln's successor following the assassination, provided an early and particularly clear example of this dynamic when he vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. His stated argument was that providing newly freed Black Americans with basic legal protections and civil rights after the Civil War would actually amount to giving them more rights and privileges than those enjoyed by white citizens, thereby creating an unfair system of reverse discrimination. This argument was factually absurd. The proposed legislation simply sought to provide basic legal protections and equal treatment under law, but it proved politically effective because it appealed to white fears about losing status and privilege. When members of a dominant group are successfully led to feel that their position and authority in society is being unfairly eroded by undeserving outsiders, this creates a powerful psychological foundation for resentment, anger, and support for increasingly extreme political measures, manufacturing moral panics around law and order. There are numerous sophisticated techniques through which this foundational sense of victimhood can be amplified and directed towards specific political objectives, but one of the most consistently effective approaches involves the deliberate manufacturing of moral panics, particularly those centered around issues of law and order, public safety, and criminal justice. The basic formula typically follows a predictable pattern. Groups that have already been defined as fundamentally different from and inferior to the dominant population are systematically portrayed as representing direct, immediate, and existential threats to the security, safety, and well-being of law-abiding members of the national community. Carefully chosen language plays a crucial role in this process. Phrases like criminal aliens are deployed to paint extremely broad characterizations of entire ethnic or immigrant communities, regardless of whether individual members of those communities have actually broken any laws or committed any crimes. The goal is to create mental associations between group membership and criminal behavior that bypass rational evaluation of actual crime statistics or individual circumstances. When members of these targeted groups dare to organize politically, speak out against discrimination, or protest unjust treatment, their activities are quickly and systematically labeled as riots, violence, or terrorism that requires harsh suppression by law enforcement or even military forces. The underlying message is clear. Anything and everything must be done to protect us from them, even if such measures require going well outside established legal norms, constitutional protections, or democratic processes. Manipulation of sexual anxieties and gender roles. Another particularly potent technique for amplifying victimhood narratives and moral panics involves the systematic manipulation of sexual anxieties and fears about changing gender roles within society. This strategy typically revolves around promoting the idea that if traditional patriarchal norms and gender hierarchies are undermined or challenged, women and children will inevitably become vulnerable to various forms of danger posed by the targeted other groups. One historical manifestation of this dynamic can be seen clearly in the development and deployment of dangerous racial caricatures, such as the myth of the black male rapist that was systematically promoted throughout the American South during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This deliberately constructed stereotype bore no relationship to actual crime statistics or patterns of sexual violence, but it proved psychologically powerful in justifying lynchings, racial terror campaigns, and the systematic exclusion of Black Americans from political participation and economic opportunity. In contemporary American politics, similar dynamics can be observed in the moral panics that have been systematically manufactured around transgender rights, particularly those involving transgender youth and their access to education, healthcare, and public accommodations. These campaigns typically involve inflammatory and misleading discussions about gender ideology, which is framed by opponents as a corrupting external influence that is somehow destroying traditional family values and threatening the safety of children. The actual policy issues at stake in these debates, such as access to appropriate medical care, protection from bullying and discrimination, or the ability to participate fully in school and community activities, become almost entirely obscured by apocalyptic rhetoric about societal collapse and the corruption of youth. The goal is not to engage in good faith policy discussions, but rather to generate fear, anger, and political mobilization among conservative voters. Targeting urban centers and liberal democracy. To make these moral panics even more politically effective, they are frequently tied to broader narratives about the perceived decadence and corruption of cosmopolitan urban centers and the liberal political elites who are portrayed as enabling, encouraging, or actively promoting these supposed threats to traditional values and social stability. In this expanded narrative framework, the problem is not simply that minority communities need to be more strictly controlled or suppressed. Rather, the deeper issue is that liberal democratic politics itself, viewed as fundamentally weak, corrupt, and permissive, has allowed minority influence and alternative values to grow and spread throughout society in the first place. This systematic reframing of liberalism, democratic pluralism, and constitutional protections as sources of social decay and national weakness sets the stage for glorifying an alternative vision of politics based on authoritarian leadership, the suppression of dissent, and the privileging of a supposedly pure and unspoiled heartland that represents the true core and essence of the national community. Chapter 4. The mythologization of heartland versus urban divide. When it comes to constructing powerful and emotionally resonant political narratives, the perceived division between urban and rural areas functions as one of the most compelling and effective ways to mobilize large segments of the population around fascist themes and objectives. This urban-rural divide is presented in starkly moral terms, with cities systematically depicted as centers of moral decay, political corruption, cultural degeneracy, and foreign influence, while rural areas are simultaneously glorified as representing everything pure, authentic, and valuable about the national character. The idealized vision of rural heartland. On one side of this constructed divide, fascist narratives present an idealized image of the rural heartland, a supposedly glorious place where traditional values, moral purity, and authentic national culture remain untouched and unspoiled by the corrupting influences of liberal decadence, multiculturalism, and cosmopolitan sophistication. The inhabitants of this mythical heartland are portrayed as hard-working, self-reliant, morally upright citizens who live in close-knit communities that have successfully preserved traditional ways of life and time-tested social arrangements. These rural communities are presented as the true foundation of national strength and prosperity, populated by people who understand the value of honest work, personal responsibility, family loyalty, and respect for authority. They are the ones who grow the food that feeds the nation, extract the natural resources that power the economy, and maintain the traditional cultural practices that define authentic national identity. Of course, such romantic depictions of rural life, while deeply appealing to many people, represent largely mythological constructions that bear little relationship to the complex realities of contemporary rural communities. Modern rural areas face significant challenges, including economic decline, population loss, limited access to healthcare and education, substance abuse problems, and social isolation that cannot be addressed through nostalgic appeals to traditional values alone. But despite its factual limitations, this idealized vision of the heartland has proven to be remarkably resilient and politically powerful as a way to tap into widespread popular desires for simplicity, authenticity, and clear moral guidelines as an antidote to the perceived chaos, complexity, and moral ambiguity of contemporary social and political life. This mythological framework was extensively embraced and promoted by Nazi propagandists who consistently portrayed German farmers and rural communities as the guardians of the nation's racial health, cultural purity, and biological vitality. In Nazi ideology, rural areas represented the source of the nation's ability to reproduce itself, both culturally and biologically, serving as reservoirs of traditional values and genetic material that could resist the corrupting influences of urban life and foreign contamination. The demonization of urban centers, in sharp and deliberate contrast to the idealized rural heartland. Urban centers are systematically portrayed in fascist narratives as modern equivalents of the biblical cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, places where moral decay, cultural corruption, and social pathology have reached such extreme levels that they represent existential threats to the health and survival of the broader national community. These cities are characterized as symbols and sources of virtually all of society's problems and challenges. They are portrayed as cesspools of racial and cultural mixing, where traditional social hierarchies have been overturned, where foreign influences have gained dangerous amounts of power and influence, and where liberal ideology has been allowed to flourish unchecked, systematically undermining the nation's most cherished traditions and values. Adolf Hitler provided one of the most influential and extensively developed examples of this anti-urban rhetoric in his writings about Vienna, Austria's cosmopolitan capital city, where he spent several formative years of his early adulthood. For Hitler, Vienna represented everything that was wrong with modern urban life. He described the city as a poisonous snake that he saw as filled with what he termed blood mixing, the supposed bastardization and corruption of pure Germanic culture through contact with Jewish, Slavic, and other populations that he regarded as racially inferior and culturally destructive. Hitler's descriptions of urban life consistently emphasized themes of contamination, corruption, and cultural decay that he attributed to the mixing of different ethnic and religious communities in close proximity. He portrayed cities as places where traditional authority structures had broken down, where moral standards had collapsed, and where foreign influences had gained the power to reshape society according to their own interests, rather than those of the supposedly authentic national community. The political effectiveness of urban-rural narratives. Such narratives prove particularly effective at drawing clear political battle lines because they often resonate deeply with communities that are already feeling left behind by rapid economic change, technological transformation, and shifting cultural norms. Rather than grappling with the complex socio-economic factors that contribute to rural economic decline, such as technological automation, global trade patterns, corporate consolidation, or the shift toward knowledge-based industries, these simplified narratives offer an appealing alternative explanation.
Complex problems involving global economic forces, technological change, and long-term demographic trends are replaced by much simpler diagnoses that focus on supposedly malicious human actors. The root of rural communities' problems and feelings of alienation is attributed to distant urban elites and their morally questionable lifestyles, values, and political priorities. The narrative suggests that while heartland communities have put in all the hard work that keeps the nation's economy functioning and its people fed, it is the cities and their inhabitants who profit undeservedly from this labour, siphoning off resources and wealth while contributing nothing of real value in return. This zero-sum framing portrays urban prosperity as necessarily coming at the expense of rural communities, rather than recognizing the complex ways in which urban and rural economies are actually interdependent. Contemporary examples of heartland mythology. You don't have to look back to Nazi Germany or other historical examples to see this mythology playing out in contemporary politics. In 2014, Republican candidates in Minnesota's state elections provided a particularly clear and well-documented example of how these themes continue to be deployed in modern American political campaigns. These candidates explicitly blamed big city Democrats for supposedly taking all the tax money generated by hard-working rural communities while simultaneously forcing their urban values and cultural priorities on heartland populations who wanted nothing to do with liberal social policies or multicultural initiatives. In subsequent interviews and polling conducted after the election, many rural voters echoed these themes, expressing the widely held belief that the taxes they paid were being unfairly redistributed to fund urban development projects, social programs, and cultural initiatives that provided no benefit to rural communities while actively undermining their traditional values and ways of life. However, when researchers actually examined Minnesota's state budget and tax flows, they discovered that this widely believed narrative was completely false. The state's urban areas actually contributed significantly more money to the tax system than they received back in state spending, while rural communities were net beneficiaries of state expenditures, receiving more per capita in government funding than they contributed in tax revenue. The fact that this counter-narrative based on actual fiscal data had no impact on rural voter attitudes demonstrates the power of mythological thinking over factual information. Once these emotional frameworks become established, they tend to be remarkably resistant to correction through evidence or rational argument, redefining national membership and worth. The ultimate result of these carefully constructed urban-rural narratives is to fundamentally redefine who is considered a valuable, contributing, and deserving member of the national community. Rural residents are elevated to the status of the real Americans, or true patriots, whose hard work, traditional values, and cultural authenticity give them superior claims to political representation and government resources. Urban residents, by contrast, are implicitly or explicitly portrayed as parasitic, unproductive, culturally corrupted, and potentially disloyal members of the national community whose political preferences and cultural values should be regarded with suspicion and whose claims to equal representation should be questioned or rejected entirely. This redefinition of national membership creates the psychological and political foundation for justifying increasingly unequal treatment of different groups within society, setting the stage for the systematic dismantling of commitments to collective well-being, universal social programs, and equal protection under law that we will examine in the next section. Chapter 5: The Erosion of Social Solidarity and Collective Responsibility. With the careful construction and widespread acceptance of the urban-rural division, creating a sharp distinction between a supposedly hard-working, deserving us and a supposedly parasitic, undeserving them, the political groundwork has been laid for systematically chipping away at societal commitments to collective well-being, universal public services,
and comprehensive social safety nets that benefit all members of society regardless of their group membership or perceived worthiness. Selective compassion and deserving victims. This erosion of social solidarity can be clearly observed in the dramatically varying levels of state support, media attention, and public sympathy given to different communities when they face similar types of crises or disasters. While some groups may be immediately deemed deserving of extensive aid, resources, and national attention when they experience hardships, others, such as Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria or predominantly black communities affected by natural disasters, are told they simply need to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps and stop expecting government assistance. The differential response to Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans versus Hurricane Sandy in New York and New Jersey provides a clear example of how these dynamics operate in practice. While both disasters caused extensive damage and human suffering, the speed, scale, and generosity of federal response varied dramatically, based in part on perceptions about which communities were considered more deserving of assistance and which were viewed as potentially responsible for their own predicament. These patterns of selective compassion serve to normalize the idea that some citizens are more valuable and deserving than others, undermining the foundational democratic principle that all citizens possess equal worth and equal claims to protection and assistance from their government during times of crisis. The perverse logic of work-based worth. When taken to its most extreme and logically consistent conclusion, this process of dividing society into deserving and undeserving groups ultimately leads to slogans and policies that echo some of the darkest chapters in human history. The infamous phrase, Arbeit macht frei, or work will set you free, which was cynically displayed over the gates of Auschwitz and other Nazi concentration camps, represents the ultimate expression of this ideology. This slogan perversely declared that forced labor could somehow purify people from their supposed inherent laziness, moral corruption, or racial undesirability, that through sufficient suffering and degradation, even supposedly inferior people might potentially earn their right to exist within the national community. Of course, this was always a lie. The real purpose was to extract maximum labor value from condemned populations before their systematic murder. While contemporary political movements rarely express such extreme positions explicitly, the underlying logic that a person's worth and right to social support should be determined by their perceived productivity, cultural conformity, and group membership remains remarkably persistent in political discourse around welfare policy, immigration, criminal justice, and social services. The systematic dismantling of cross-cutting institutions. The road to such extreme outcomes of dehumanization and social exclusion does not unfold suddenly or all at once. Rather, it develops gradually through a systematic process that unfolds in recognizable stages. Understanding these stages and learning to identify their early warning signs becomes critically important for anyone hoping to resist or reverse these trends before they reach their logical conclusion. One of the crucial early steps in this process involves the ideological isolation and systematic devaluation of groups that have been targeted for exclusion from the national community. But equally important is the deliberate erosion of social structures, institutions, and organizations that foster solidarity and cooperation across different demographic lines, such as class, gender, race, religion, or regional identity. Labor unions provide an excellent example of institutions that historically served to unite working people from diverse backgrounds around common economic goals and shared interests in workplace safety, fair wages, and job security. These organizations brought together workers regardless of their racial, ethnic, or religious differences, creating powerful coalitions that could effectively challenge both corporate power and political authoritarianism. One method through which labor unions are being systematically weakened in the United States involves so-called right-to-work laws, which prohibit requiring workers to join unions or pay union dues as a condition of employment. While these laws are typically presented in terms of individual freedom and worker choice, their practical effect is to dramatically decrease union membership density, reduce collective bargaining power, and weaken the financial resources available for political advocacy and worker organizing. But the real agenda behind many of these efforts can be far more sinister than simple opposition to union power. To deliberately divide the working class against itself, particularly along racial and ethnic lines, making it much more difficult to build the broad-based coalitions necessary to resist authoritarian political movements and corporate domination. When cross-cutting social institutions are weakened or destroyed, and when universal social welfare programs are systematically eroded or eliminated, individual citizens are left increasingly isolated, economically vulnerable, and psychologically dependent on the protection and patronage of powerful leaders who claim to be their only reliable defenders against a hostile world. The dangerous cycle of authoritarian normalization. This process of social atomization and institutional destruction creates the conditions in which desperate populations begin crying out for desperate measures, for strong leaders who promise to act decisively to redeem what they portray as a broken and corrupted society, regardless of whether their proposed solutions conform to democratic norms, constitutional limitations, or respect for human rights. This represents the point where the danger escalates most dramatically. With each deviation from established democratic processes and constitutional constraints, the baseline of what is considered normal political behavior begins to shift incrementally but persistently. Actions that would have been widely recognized as unacceptable authoritarian overreach just a few years earlier become increasingly normalized, rationalized as necessary responses to extraordinary circumstances, or even celebrated as evidence of strong, decisive leadership. With each additional transgression against democratic norms, whether involving the suppression of voting rights, the intimidation of opposition politicians, the persecution of journalists and activists, or the use of government power to reward friends and punish enemies, it becomes progressively easier for even more extreme measures to be introduced and accepted by significant portions of the population. This represents perhaps the most dangerous aspect of creeping authoritarianism. Its gradual, incremental nature makes it difficult for many people to recognize the cumulative significance of individual steps until the process has advanced so far that reversing course becomes extremely difficult or impossible through conventional political means. The urgency of recognition and resistance. This is precisely why it becomes so critically important for citizens, political leaders, journalists, educators, and civil society organizations to remain vigilant in identifying and calling out these processes for what they are, even when they may seem relatively mild or reasonable in isolation. What begins with seemingly innocent narratives about us and them, with romantic appeals to a mythologized past, or with calls for law and order, can rapidly escalate into systematic campaigns of dehumanization and the complete dismantling of democratic institutions and social cohesion. Calling out these tactics and rhetorical strategies for what they represent, deliberate attempts to undermine democratic governance and social solidarity, constitutes the essential first step toward building effective resistance to their dehumanizing influence. Only by developing the analytical tools and political courage necessary to recognize fascist strategies in their early stages can democratic societies hope to preserve the institutions, values, and relationships that make civilized life possible. It is only through such recognition and resistance
that we can hope to preserve and strengthen societies based on empathy, mutual aid, democratic participation, and respect for human dignity, rather than allowing them to be transformed into hierarchical systems based on dominance, exclusion, and the systematic oppression of vulnerable populations. Chapter 6: Historical Patterns and Contemporary Applications. Understanding how fascist movements have successfully captured power in the past provides essential insights for recognizing similar patterns in contemporary political developments. While the specific cultural contexts, technological tools, and immediate circumstances may differ significantly between historical and contemporary cases, the underlying psychological dynamics and strategic approaches remain remarkably consistent across time and geography. The Weimar Republic and the normalization of extremism. The collapse of the Weimar Republic in Germany provides one of the most thoroughly documented and analyzed examples of how democratic institutions can be systematically undermined from within through the strategic application of fascist political techniques. The Nazi Party's rise to power was not the result of a sudden military coup or popular revolution. Instead, it represented the culmination of a gradual process through which extremist political positions became increasingly normalized within mainstream political discourse. During the economic crisis that followed World War I and the global economic depression of the early 1930s, traditional conservative political parties increasingly found themselves unable to provide effective solutions to Germany's mounting problems. Rather than defending democratic institutions and constitutional governance, many conservative politicians chose to form tactical alliances with Nazi leaders, believing they could control and manipulate Hitler's movement for their own political advantage. This miscalculation proved catastrophic. Conservative politicians like Franz von Papen and others convinced themselves that they could use Nazi popular support to advance their own agendas while keeping Hitler's more extreme tendencies in check through institutional constraints and political maneuvering. Instead, they provided the Nazi movement with the legitimacy and access to power that it needed to systematically dismantle German democracy from within. The lesson from this historical example is clear. Fascist movements often come to power not through overwhelming popular support or successful revolutions, but rather through the miscalculations and tactical compromises of mainstream political leaders who believe they can control extremist forces for their own benefit. Contemporary parallels and warning signs. While direct historical comparisons must be made carefully and with appropriate attention to different contexts and circumstances, many scholars and political observers have identified troubling parallels between the strategic approaches used by historical fascist movements and tactics employed by contemporary authoritarian leaders and political movements around the world. The systematic attacks on independent journalism and press freedom that we observe in many countries today echo historical patterns of fascist movements seeking to control information flows and eliminate independent sources of accountability. When political leaders consistently label unfavorable news coverage as fake news or enemy of the people, they are employing strategies designed to undermine public trust in independent sources of information and create space for their own propaganda narratives to flourish without challenge. Similarly, the contemporary tendency to portray political opposition as fundamentally illegitimate, not merely wrong on policy issues, but actually treasonous, criminal, or un-American, mirrors historical fascist strategies for delegitimizing democratic competition and justifying increasingly extreme measures against political opponents. The systematic promotion of conspiracy theories, particularly those that portray complex social problems as the result of hidden plots by evil elites or foreign agents, serves the same function today that similar narratives served in the 1930s. creating a sense of existential threat that justifies abandoning normal democratic constraints and constitutional protections in favor of strong leadership and decisive action. The role of economic anxiety and social displacement. Historical analysis reveals that fascist movements tend to gain their strongest support during periods of rapid economic change, social disruption, and cultural transformation, when large numbers of people feel that their traditional ways of life are under threat. These conditions create psychological openness to authoritarian solutions and nostalgic appeals to restore a mythologized past. Contemporary economic developments, including technological automation, globalization, the decline of traditional manufacturing industries, and the growth of service and knowledge-based economies, have created similar conditions of economic anxiety and social displacement in many developed countries. These changes have left millions of people feeling economically insecure and culturally marginalized, creating fertile ground for political movements that promise to restore previous economic arrangements and social hierarchies. The key insight from historical analysis is that these legitimate economic grievances and cultural anxieties can be channeled in either democratic or authoritarian directions, depending on the political leadership and narrative frameworks that are available to help people make sense of their experiences. Progressive political movements can address economic insecurity through expanded social programs, worker protections, and inclusive economic policies, while fascist movements exploit the same anxieties to promote scapegoating, nationalism, and authoritarian solutions. The crucial role of institutional defenders. One of the most important factors determining whether democratic societies successfully resist fascist movements or succumb to authoritarian capture involves the willingness of institutional leaders, judges, military officers, civil servants, journalists, educators, and religious leaders, to defend democratic norms and constitutional principles even when doing so becomes politically costly or personally dangerous. Historical cases demonstrate that fascist movements can be successfully resisted when institutional leaders maintain their commitment to democratic values and refuse to collaborate with or normalize authoritarian behavior. Conversely, when institutional leaders prioritize their own short-term interests, career advancement, or partisan political goals over their constitutional responsibilities, democratic institutions can be quickly captured and transformed into instruments of authoritarian control. This places enormous responsibility on contemporary institutional leaders to understand the historical patterns and recognize their own crucial role in either facilitating or preventing authoritarian capture of democratic institutions. Judges must be willing to uphold constitutional principles, even when doing so conflicts with political pressure. Military leaders must maintain their oath to defend the Constitution rather than any individual political leader. Journalists must continue investigating and reporting truth even when it becomes dangerous or economically difficult to do so. Chapter 7. The Psychology of Fascist Appeal. Understanding why fascist movements can attract significant popular support even among educated populations and democratic societies, requires examining the psychological needs and emotional appeals that these movements exploit with remarkable effectiveness. The appeal of certainty in uncertain times. One of the most powerful psychological attractions of fascist ideology involves its promise of certainty, clarity, and simple solutions during periods of complexity, ambiguity, and rapid social change. Modern life confronts individuals with countless choices, competing information sources, complex moral dilemmas, and uncertain economic futures that can feel overwhelming and anxiety-provoking. Fascist movements offer relief from this cognitive and emotional burden by providing clear answers to complicated questions, identifying obvious enemies to blame for complex problems, and promising that strong leadership can cut through confusion and restore order. The appeal of these simplistic narratives often proves stronger than more accurate but complex explanations that require sustained attention, critical thinking, and tolerance for ambiguity. This psychological dynamic helps explain why fascist movements often gain support among people who are not necessarily economically disadvantaged, but who feel overwhelmed by the pace of social change or uncertain about their place in rapidly evolving social hierarchies. The promise of returning to supposedly simpler times when social roles were clearer and moral guidelines were universally accepted can appeal to anyone experiencing anxiety about contemporary complexity. The seductive power of group identity and belonging. Fascist movements also exploit fundamental human needs for group belonging, social identity, and collective purpose that may not be adequately fulfilled by other available social institutions or political movements. In societies where traditional sources of community, extended families, religious congregations, neighborhood organizations, labor unions, or civic associations have weakened or disappeared, fascist movements can provide powerful alternative sources of identity and belonging. The experience of participating in mass rallies, wearing distinctive symbols or clothing, chanting collective slogans, and feeling part of a larger historical mission can generate intense emotional satisfaction and psychological reward that many people find difficult to obtain through other means in modern individualistic societies. Moreover, fascist movements often provide their members with a sense of special knowledge, insider status, and moral superiority that can be deeply gratifying for people who feel marginalized, ignored, or disrespected in other areas of their lives. The belief that you possess secret knowledge about hidden conspiracies, that you are part of an elect group fighting for ultimate truth, or that you are defending civilization itself against existential threats can provide powerful psychological compensation for feelings of powerlessness or insignificance in other domains. The exploitation of masculine identity crisis. Many contemporary fascist and authoritarian movements have proven particularly effective at exploiting anxieties about changing gender roles and evolving definitions of masculinity in modern societies. Traditional masculine identities that were based on physical strength, economic breadwinning, military service, or patriarchal authority within families have been challenged by economic changes, feminist movements, and evolving social norms. Rather than helping men adapt to these changes in healthy ways that preserve dignity while embracing more egalitarian relationships, fascist movements offer the false promise of restoring traditional masculine dominance through political action and cultural warfare. This can prove especially appealing to men who feel economically insecure, romantically unsuccessful, or socially marginalized. The emphasis on strength, dominance, conflict, and hierarchy that characterizes fascist ideology provides a framework for understanding personal struggles in political terms, while promising that supporting authoritarian leadership will somehow restore individual masculine status and social respect. The dark satisfaction of sanctioned cruelty. Perhaps most disturbingly, fascist movements can also satisfy psychological needs for expressing aggression, dominance, and cruelty that are normally constrained by social norms and legal restrictions in democratic societies. By designating certain groups as enemies of the nation who deserve harsh treatment, fascist ideologies provide moral justification for behavior that would normally be considered cruel, unjust, or sadistic. This can prove particularly appealing to individuals who harbor resentments, prejudices, or aggressive impulses that they normally must suppress in order to function in polite society. Fascist movements promise that these normally forbidden emotions and behaviors can be expressed as patriotic duties or moral necessities rather than personal failings or antisocial impulses. The psychological satisfaction of participating in collective punishment of designated enemies, whether through legal persecution, economic boycotts, social ostracism, or physical violence, can provide powerful emotional rewards that help explain why fascist movements often maintain enthusiastic support even when their policies clearly harm the material interests of many of their own supporters. Chapter 8. Recognizing and responding to fascist strategies. Given the sophisticated nature of fascist political strategies and their demonstrated ability to capture democratic institutions from within, citizens, political leaders, and civil society organizations must develop equally sophisticated approaches to recognition, resistance, and democratic renewal. Early warning systems and diagnostic tools. The first step in effective resistance involves developing reliable early warning systems that can identify fascist strategies and tactics before they become sufficiently entrenched to threaten democratic institutions. This requires moving beyond simple partisan political analysis to focus on specific behaviors, rhetorical patterns, and institutional changes that indicate authoritarian capture, regardless of which political party or ideological movement is implementing them. Key warning signs include systematic attacks on independent journalism and press freedom, efforts to delegitimize political opposition through accusations of treason or foreign influence, the promotion of conspiracy theories that portray complex problems as simple conflicts between good and evil forces, appeals to restore mythologized past eras when the nation was supposedly stronger and more unified, the systematic scapegoating of minority groups for broader social problems, and efforts to undermine confidence in democratic institutions like elections, courts, or legislatures. Equally important are changes in political discourse and social norms that normalize previously unacceptable behavior. When political leaders regularly lie without consequences, when violence becomes accepted as a legitimate political tool, when constitutional constraints are dismissed as partisan obstacles, or when basic facts become matters of tribal loyalty rather than empirical investigation, these represent serious threats to democratic governance, regardless of the specific policy positions being advanced. Institutional strengthening and democratic renewal. Recognizing fascist strategies represents only the first step in effective resistance. Equally important is the proactive work of strengthening democratic institutions and social relationships that can provide effective alternatives to authoritarian appeals. This requires both defensive measures to protect existing democratic institutions and offensive strategies to address the underlying conditions that make fascist movements attractive to significant portions of the population. Defensive measures might include strengthening ethical rules and enforcement mechanisms for public officials, improving transparency and accountability in government operations, protecting voting rights and election integrity, supporting independent journalism and media literacy education, and defending the independence of courts, law enforcement, and other key institutions from partisan political interference. But defensive measures alone are insufficient if they are not accompanied by positive efforts to address the legitimate grievances and unmet needs that fascist movements exploit. This requires developing progressive political alternatives that can provide economic security, social belonging, and collective purpose through democratic rather than authoritarian means. Economic policies that provide genuine security and opportunity for working families. Social programs that strengthen community bonds and mutual support. Educational initiatives that promote critical thinking and civic engagement. And cultural movements that celebrate diversity while building shared identity around democratic values. All of these represent essential components of comprehensive anti-fascist strategy. Building coalitions and solidarity networks. Perhaps most importantly, effective resistance to fascism requires building broad coalitions that unite diverse groups around shared commitments to democratic values and human dignity. Fascist movements succeed in part by dividing potential opposition groups against each other through appeals to narrow self-interest, cultural prejudices, or ideological purism that prevents effective cooperation. Successful anti-fascist coalitions must include not only traditional progressive activists and organizations, but also conservatives who remain committed to constitutional governance, business leaders who understand that democratic stability serves their long-term interests, religious communities that take seriously their ethical obligations to protect vulnerable populations, and cultural institutions that depend on freedom of expression and intellectual inquiry. These coalitions must be based on more than temporary tactical convenience. They require developing genuine relationships, mutual understanding, and shared commitments that can withstand the inevitable disagreements and conflicts that arise in any diverse political movement. This means investing time and energy in relationship building, conflict resolution, and the difficult work of building trust across different communities and constituencies. Conclusion: the ongoing struggle for democratic civilization. Jason Stanley's analysis in How Fascism Works provides essential insights into one of the most urgent political challenges of our time, understanding how democratic societies can drift toward authoritarian governance and developing effective strategies for preventing such transitions before they become irreversible. The universality of fascist techniques. Perhaps the most important insight from Stanley's work is that fascist political strategies are not unique historical curiosities associated with particular countries, cultures, or time periods. Rather, they represent a systematic approach to political power that can emerge in any society where democratic institutions are weak, social solidarity is fragmented, and significant portions of the population feel economically insecure or culturally threatened. This universality means that no society, regardless of its democratic traditions, educational levels, economic prosperity, or cultural sophistication, can consider itself immune to fascist movements. The techniques Stanley analyzes have proven effective across widely different contexts because they exploit fundamental aspects of human psychology and social organization that remain constant across cultures and historical periods. Understanding this universality is crucial for several reasons. First, it helps explain why we observe similar patterns of authoritarian mobilization in countries as different as the United States, Hungary, Brazil, India, and the Philippines, despite their very different histories and cultural contexts. Second, it suggests that resistance strategies developed in one context may be applicable in others, allowing for international learning and cooperation among democratic movements. The incremental nature of democratic erosion. Stanley's analysis also emphasizes the gradual, incremental nature of most successful fascist movements, which rarely announce their ultimate intentions openly or attempt to seize power through dramatic confrontations with existing institutions. Instead, they work systematically to normalize previously unacceptable behavior, shift the boundaries of acceptable political discourse, and capture existing institutions from within. This incremental approach makes fascist movements particularly dangerous because each individual step may seem relatively minor or reasonable in isolation, making it difficult for observers to recognize the cumulative significance of the overall trajectory until the process has advanced so far that reversal becomes extremely difficult. The lesson for democratic societies is that vigilance cannot wait until obviously authoritarian measures are proposed or implemented. By that point, the psychological and institutional groundwork for accepting such measures may already be too well established for effective resistance. Instead, democratic vigilance must focus on the early stages of the process, the initial attacks on truth and reality, the first efforts to normalize us versus them thinking, the beginning attempts to undermine confidence in democratic institutions. The responsibility of democratic citizens. Perhaps most challenging, Stanley's analysis suggests that the ultimate responsibility for preventing fascist movements from succeeding rests with ordinary democratic citizens who must choose whether to support, resist, or remain passive in the face of authoritarian appeals and tactics.
This places enormous moral and political responsibility on individuals who may feel unprepared for such weighty decisions, or who may prefer to focus on their private lives rather than engaging with complex political challenges. But Stanley's historical analysis makes clear that passive neutrality in the face of fascist movements effectively constitutes collaboration with their objectives. Democratic citizenship in the contemporary era requires not only voting in elections and following basic laws, but also developing the knowledge, skills, and moral courage necessary to recognize and resist authoritarian strategies when they emerge. This includes media literacy to identify misinformation and propaganda, historical knowledge to recognize dangerous patterns from the past, critical thinking skills to evaluate complex political claims, and the social relationships necessary to build effective resistance coalitions. The possibility of democratic renewal. Despite the serious threats that Stanley's analysis identifies, his work also suggests reasons for hope and optimism about the possibility of democratic renewal and resistance to authoritarian capture. Historical examples demonstrate that fascist movements can be successfully resisted when democratic institutions remain strong, when civil society organizations maintain their independence and effectiveness, and when sufficient numbers of citizens choose to actively defend democratic values. The key insight is that democracy is not a fixed system that either exists or doesn't exist, but rather an ongoing process that requires constant renewal, adaptation, and active participation by engaged citizens. Threats to democratic governance create opportunities for democratic renewal if they motivate citizens to become more engaged, institutions to become more responsive and accountable, and political leaders to recommit themselves to constitutional principles and democratic norms. The ultimate message of how fascism works is both warning and call to action. Warning about the sophisticated strategies that authoritarian movements use to capture democratic societies, and a call for citizens to develop equally sophisticated strategies for recognition, resistance, and democratic renewal. The outcome is not predetermined. It depends on the choices that millions of individual citizens make about whether to support, resist, or remain passive in the face of authoritarian appeals. Final reflections on truth, solidarity, and human dignity. In the end, Stanley's analysis suggests that the struggle against fascism is fundamentally a struggle to preserve and strengthen societies based on truth rather than propaganda, solidarity rather than division, and respect for human dignity rather than hierarchies of domination and exclusion. These values do not maintain themselves automatically. They require active cultivation, defense, and renewal by each generation of citizens who must choose whether to pass on democratic institutions and values to their children, or allow them to be captured and corrupted by authoritarian movements. The stakes could not be higher. As Stanley's historical analysis makes clear, the consequences of democratic failure extend far beyond political inconvenience or policy disagreements. When fascist movements successfully capture state power, the results include systematic persecution of vulnerable populations, the destruction of civil liberties and human rights, the elimination of independent institutions and organizations, and ultimately the breakdown of civilized society itself. But the same historical record also demonstrates the remarkable capacity of ordinary people to resist even the most powerful authoritarian movements when they choose to act with courage, solidarity, and commitment to democratic values. The techniques that Stanley analyzes provide essential tools for understanding how fascist movements operate. But the ultimate power to resist such movements remains in the hands of citizens who choose to use their knowledge, relationships, and institutions to defend democracy rather than allowing it to be destroyed from within. The choice belongs to each of us, and the time for choosing is now.